Today's gospel selection was taken from the Sermon on the Mount, as the Sermon on the Mount comes towards its final conclusion. And in it there's a dire warning for all believers, but a dire warning for the likes of me, priests or ministers, who have lived their lives trying to do mighty deeds in the name of Jesus, casting out devils, performing miracles, prophesying. But Jesus said that won't be enough. If you don't act on the words of this Sermon on the Mount and really live them, the words of this sermon are the words and wisdom from my Father. If you don't take them to heart, as Moses would say, if you haven't written them on your soul and reflected them in your life, in your actions, in your gestures, when the final judgment comes, Jesus will say, I never knew you. What a powerful and sobering warning that is. Now, when Matthew's gospel comes to its conclusion, the very last public sermon Jesus gives before his arrest and his death on Calvary concludes with the separation of the sheep and goats, the final judgment. This too is echoing what he said in the Sermon on the Mount, when the goats would say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and not feed you? When did we see you naked and not clothe you? When did we see you sick or imprisoned and not visit you? And Jesus would say, whenever you neglected to do it to the least human being, you failed to do it to me. A powerful warning for all those who put their faith in Jesus. It's His grace that saves us and sets us free, that makes us whole and even holy. But if that grace is not bearing fruit in our lives, there's something really and truly and profoundly wrong. One of the reasons the world hesitates to accept the gospel of Jesus, the gospel of Christ, is because His disciples, His followers, don't act redeemed, don't look forgiven, don't love the way He taught. And that's why so much of our spiritual life has to be based on an honest penitential spirit. We begin the Mass with pleading, Lord, have mercy on me. And it should come from the depths of our soul. And you'll notice throughout the liturgy, the mercy of God is invoked over and over, right up until the moment before we receive communion, when we say, Lord, I'm still not worthy, but you say the word, and my soul will be healed. Now, reflecting on our need to live a godly life is not to make us feel more guilty. All of us here carry around in our souls and minds and hearts enough emotional guilt to sink the Titanic. Our spirits are weighed down by that guilt. But reflecting on our responsibilities is to help us live our lives to the fullest according to God's plan. And Jesus promises us in this Sermon on the Mount and in the passage we had read to us this morning that if we build our lives on His Word and live according to His plan revealed from the Father from all eternity, then when we face storms and crises of life, our homes will be built on solid rock. Our lives will be stable in the midst of chaos. Now we look at the cultures of the world as a whole, not only in the contemporary scene, but throughout history. We see people and family and even nations ignoring the laws of God that can be found from Moses through the prophets of Israel to the Christ of Calvary. Ignoring those laws and trying to build society, cultures, homes, and families on other values. Material values, political values, values that look for fame and fortune, which are so fleeting and such imposters insofar as they promise happiness and fulfillment. Values that look to meet only the needs of individual adults rather than the needs of all of humanity. And homes and families and cultures that follow along that path when the storms and tribulations of life come tend to collapse. Now, many times we collapse as individuals and even as families and as communities. And when the collapse comes, we tend to despair. How could I have been so stupid? Why did I do that? How did I take that decision? Etc. And then we tend to despair, but it's precisely at that moment that we had Jesus, the carpenter's son, to re-enter our lives with his hammer and nails and woods and said, well, let's get started. What went wrong? Okay, we're fixing it. Now, it'll never be the same, but it can be better. But we have to let the Lord pound the nails of virtue into our hearts and souls so that our lives will hold together. We'll need to have faith. We'll need to have hope. And most of all, we'll need to have love. So that out of those three theological, godly virtues could come the hinge virtues of life that makes a man really a man and a woman really a woman. The virtue of fortitude and courage in the midst of a cowardly world and in the midst of the difficulties we all face. The virtue of patience, knowing that we won't be instantly gratified either in our prayer life, our spiritual life, our financial life, our personal life. But we'll have the patience to endure all things, hoping for the better future. We'll need a sense of prudence, which doesn't mean being overly cautious. Sometimes prudence means to immediately take bold and decisive action, like visiting the sick, clothing the hungry, visiting the imprisoned. That type of action sometimes requires an impulsive boldness, the courage and fortitude. But prudence means seeing the complexity of life and then acting in the proper fashion. And finally, we'll have a sense of right and wrong, a sense of a sense of justice, and more than a sense, a concrete knowledge of what's good and evil, right and wrong. So much of our culture today bases ethics on hunches and guesses. Well, this looks like it probably might be true. Well, who knows? Everybody has their own opinion, but I sort of think this is good for me. Yes, it's wrong for everybody else, but in these circumstances and situations, I think that it's okay for me. So much of our culture and ethics is based on ethics and morality of best guesses. But in the faith life, we have the solidity of Moses and the lawgivers of Israel and the great prophets. And we have the Christ teaching us what's really good, what's really just, what's really moral. We find it especially in the Sermon on the Mount, where he challenges us by saying, if someone wants your shirt, give him your coat. If someone forces you to walk 1 mile with him, go 2 miles. You're to turn the other cheek if someone strikes you on one, rather than leading a life of vengeance and vindictiveness. You are to even love your enemies who don't want your love and hate you. Wow. The basing our lives on that gives us a knowledge, a real knowledge of what is good and evil, right and wrong. And that gives us the strength we need to live our lives in peace and joy in the midst of a world filled with conflict and tears.